"Don't waste your money on me," said the Apache slave woman, but the cowboy paid and took her home. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late afternoon settled over the trading post with a tired heaviness, the kind that came after long hours of bargaining, loading wagons, and dealing with the rough edges of frontier life. The sun hung low above the uneven rooftops, casting narrow shadows across the yard where horses shifted in their traces and men grumbled over worn goods. Dust clung to boots and coats, rising with every step. The sound of metal striking wood, voices arguing about grain prices, and the uneven squeak of a wagon axle filled the air. Nothing about this place felt friendly, but it was the closest thing to a supply point for half a day's ride in any direction. Austin Morrow guided his bay horse through the yard with a steady hand resting lightly on the reins. He had been on the trail since dawn after checking the waterline on his ranch, which lay deep in a stretch of country most folks avoided because of its isolation. Austin preferred it that way. Years of riding with a cattle crew had left him wary of loud, careless men, and a violent dispute in his old outfit had made him walk away from group work altogether. Now, at 39, he lived alone on a modest piece of land he had rebuilt plank by plank, with only his horse and the quiet routines of ranch work to fill the days. He came to the trading post only when the shelves in his cabin grew too empty. Today he needed nails, flour, a new cinch strap, and nothing more. But as he swung down from the saddle, his attention caught on a shape in the far corner of the yard. At first he thought it was another merchant's bundle left on the ground, but when a gust of wind pushed dust aside, he saw a woman sitting with her wrists bound loosely in front of her. Her posture was stiff, and her eyes scanned every movement with the alertness of someone who had learned to read danger before it appeared. She was young, mid-20s, Apache, with bronze skin that held a warm tone even under layers of dust. Her long black hair hung over one shoulder, uneven in places as if pulled during a struggle. The deerskin dress she wore showed signs of hard travel, frayed edges, faded beadwork, and seams tightened with improvised stitching. Her breathing was controlled, almost painfully measured, the kind used by someone who refused to show fear. Several men walked past her without a glance, some with dismissive smirks, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The trader standing near her tried to draw attention, calling out prices with an impatience that made his voice crack. But no one stopped. Most men in this part of the territory considered her too much trouble, too proud, too calm, too likely to fight back, and the trader's frustration showed in his tone. Austin watched her for a long moment, trying to make sense of the situation. He wasn't looking to involve himself in anything complicated today. He had a ranch to manage, fences to mend, and enough ghosts from his past to keep him company through quiet nights. But something about the woman, the way she sat upright despite exhaustion, the way her eyes followed movement without flinching, held his focus. The trader noticed Austin's interest and straightened, wiping his hands on his vest. "You want to look at her?" he asked, half hopeful, half weary. Austin didn't answer. He stepped closer with a slow, controlled pace, his boots pressing evenly into the dirt. The woman didn't shrink away. She kept her chin lifted, meeting his gaze straight on. Her eyes were sharp, but underneath the steady stare he saw stress, caution, and a layer of resignation built from countless disappointments. When he reached her, she spoke first, her voice low and even. "Don't waste your money on me." There was no anger in her tone, no plea, just a statement shaped by experience, a clear warning that buying her meant inheriting whatever trouble followed. Austin realized instantly she wasn't trying to bargain. She was telling him the truth. He looked at her wrists. The rope wasn't tight, but it marked her situation clearly. He had seen many forms of captivity in his years on the trail, some legal, some disguised, some openly cruel. This one sat somewhere between them, and the weight of it settled heavily in his chest. Austin reached for the small pouch at his belt. The trader perked up, expecting a negotiation, but Austin didn't haggle. He counted out the coins with the same calm he used while feeding his horse each morning. The trader snatched them quickly, relief crossing his face. Austin crouched beside the woman with a slow, deliberate motion. His knees pressed into the dirt, and he drew a small knife from his boot. The blade caught a sliver of sunlight as he lifted the rope. Her shoulders tightened slightly at the movement, a silent reaction she couldn't stop. She didn't pull away, didn't look down. She simply watched him, waiting to learn his intentions through his hands. He cut the rope cleanly. It loosened and fell into the dust. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't thank him. Instead, she watched him with a mixture of confusion and guarded expectation, her mind already racing through possible outcomes. Too many men in her past had said one thing and done another. Austin sheathed his knife and stood. He didn't touch her or offer explanations. He didn't announce what she should do next. He pointed toward his horse, a single gesture, open enough that she could refuse it, simple enough that she could accept it without losing dignity. She hesitated. Her pulse tightened her throat, but she didn't show it. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from hours on the ground. Each step toward the horse carried a new layer of calculation. Why him? Why now? What will he demand? How do I escape if I must? Austin saw each question in the way she held her breath, but he didn't press her. He stayed where he stood, letting her decide how close to come. When she reached the horse, she kept her hands to herself, not touching the animal or the saddle. She waited for his next move with a steady, silent tension in her shoulders. Austin stepped into the stirrup and mounted with practiced ease. He directed the horse forward with a light tug, starting at a pace she could follow on foot. He didn't tell her to walk behind him. He didn't look back to see if she hesitated again. He simply moved as if her decision mattered more than his command. After several long moments, she followed. Her steps were careful, her breathing tight from stress and exhaustion, but she stayed close enough not to lose the trail. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived or what kind of man he was. But she understood one fact clearly. He had cut the rope without touching her skin. That alone set him apart from the last men she had known. The trading post shrank behind them until it disappeared into the horizon. The air cooled as they moved across open land, the sky deepening toward evening. Austin kept his eyes on the trail ahead, thinking quietly about the weight of responsibility he had just accepted. He hadn't planned on bringing another soul into his isolated life, especially not someone carrying wounds he didn't yet understand. But he also couldn't leave her there to be traded again. Naya, though he did not yet know her name, walked behind him with a determined pace, her mind shifting between fear, suspicion, and a faint, unfamiliar sense of relief that surprised her. They traveled together in silence, bound not by rope but by the stark truth that he had chosen, without hesitation or explanation, to take her away from the place she had been sold. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a beginning neither of them had expected when the day began. The trail leading away from the trading post stretched across uneven ground, broken by patches of dry grass and scattered rocks that glinted faintly in the fading light. Austin kept his bay horse at a controlled pace, the reins held loosely in his left hand while his right rested near the saddle horn. He didn't turn to check on the woman walking behind him, but he listened for her footsteps, steady, cautious, never dragging. The sound told him she was keeping up, but not comfortably. The day had worn her down, though she refused to show it. The air cooled as the sun dropped lower, and a light wind swept along the valley floor, carrying the smell of dust and distant juniper. Austin breathed in slowly, letting the familiar landscape settle his nerves. He had spent years learning the contours of this country, the slope of each ridge, the dry wash that widened every spring, the thick stand of cottonwoods marking the turn toward his land. Routine usually calmed him, but today it only reminded him that nothing about this situation fit into his usual patterns. He had never brought anyone home before. Not a friend, not a hired hand, not a stray traveler. His ranch had always been a place he kept to himself, a quiet refuge built after too many years of noise and conflict on cattle drives. He had chosen distance because it gave him peace, and peace was something he guarded with the same persistence he once used to protect herd animals from storms. Now, with each step his horse took, he felt the weight of the decision he had made at the trading post. He didn't regret cutting her loose, but he didn't pretend to understand what came next. Behind him, the Apache woman kept her eyes on the trail, scanning ahead for uneven spots while staying far enough back to avoid crowding the horse. Her breathing stayed controlled, but her mind moved rapidly through every possibility she could imagine. She didn't know if he expected obedience, loyalty, labor, or silence. She didn't know his name or his intentions. All she knew was that he had not touched her skin when he freed her, and that small detail set him apart from the last several men she had met. Her legs ached from the mile she had already walked earlier that day, and the rope burns on her wrists pulsed sharply with each movement, but she refused to slow down. Showing weakness around unfamiliar men had never served her well. She kept an upright posture and measured steps, forcing her body to respond as if she still had full strength. Austin finally spoke when the trail narrowed between two sloping ridges. His voice was steady, low, and without any forced gentleness. "We'll stop soon. Water ahead." He didn't turn around. He didn't check her reaction. He simply stated a fact, giving her information that mattered instead of offering comfort she might not trust. She answered with a quiet, "All right," her tone neutral. The words sounded slightly hoarse, as if she hadn't used her voice in some time. When they reached the small spring nestled between a cluster of rocks, Austin halted the horse and dismounted. He loosened the cinch and let the animal lower its head to drink. Naya paused a few feet away, waiting to see if she was permitted to approach the water. Austin stepped aside, making room for her without saying a word. The open gesture was enough. She knelt beside the spring and cupped the cold water in her hands, drinking slowly to avoid shocking her stomach. The coolness steadied her nerves and loosened the tightness along her spine. While she drank, she watched Austin from the corner of her eye. He didn't stand over her or watch her movements closely. He checked the horse's hooves, ran a hand along the animal's flank, and scanned the horizon, maintaining a quiet vigilance that spoke of long habits. She tried to understand the kind of man who behaved this way, calm, distant, protective without asking for anything in return. Most of the men she had encountered treated silence as a threat or an insult. This one treated silence as a normal part of life. Austin filled a small tin cup and set it near her without comment. She accepted it with a small nod. No gratitude was spoken aloud, but the exchange felt balanced. After a short rest, he lifted the saddle again with a slow, even movement. His strength showed in the way he handled the weight, but nothing about him felt rushed or aggressive. Once mounted, he waited until she rose on her own before he started down the trail again. The sky dimmed steadily as they approached the outskirts of his land. A line of cottonwoods marked the boundary, their branches moving gently with the evening wind. Beyond them, the outline of a cabin appeared, small, weathered, and standing alone in a wide clearing bordered by brush and low hills. Naya halted for a moment, taking in the sight. The cabin looked maintained, but simple, with smoke drifting lightly from the chimney. It didn't resemble the places where men gathered to drink or trade. It looked lived in by one person who relied on routine and order. Austin noticed she had paused, but didn't question her. He guided the horse toward the corral and dismounted again. He opened the gate, led the horse inside, and began removing the saddle. The evening light caught the tension in his shoulders, revealing a quiet fatigue from the day. Naya stood near the edge of the clearing, unsure whether to approach the cabin or wait for instructions. Her pulse quickened as she assessed every detail: the distance to the trees, the location of the barn, the angle of the door. Old habits made her look for escape routes, even when she wasn't running. Austin finished with the horse before acknowledging her. He pointed once toward the cabin door, not demanding entry, only letting her know where shelter was. His face stayed unreadable, but nothing in his stance hinted at harm. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and stepped toward the door. Every movement brought new questions. What kind of man was he? Why had he spent money on someone he didn't know? What did he expect now that they stood on his land? But she walked forward anyway. Behind her, Austin watched with a quiet seriousness, aware that this moment would set the tone for everything that came next. Neither trusted the other yet, But both understood one thing clearly. Their life had shifted in ways they couldn't undo, and the night had only just begun. The cabin door opened with a soft scrape, revealing a room shaped by years of solitary work rather than comfort. Lamplight flickered from a small lantern hanging on a hook near the window, sending a steady glow across plain wooden walls. Every object had a purpose. A single bed pushed against the far side, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, a stove with a neat stack of chopped wood beside it, and shelves lined with basic tools and folded cloth. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. Naya stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning corners, shadows, and exits with the instinct of someone who had survived too many unpredictable places. The air held the scent of pine boards, cold iron, and faint smoke, clean, controlled, familiar to Austin but foreign to her. She stood near the doorway, uncertain if she was expected to move further. Austin entered behind her but stayed a respectful distance away, closing the door without locking it. He hung his coat on a peg and removed his hat, shaking off dust before setting it down. His movements were quiet and deliberate, revealing a man who had lived alone long enough to keep noise to a minimum. He reached for a tin cup on the shelf, filled it with water from a jug, and placed it on the table. The gesture wasn't forced or symbolic. It was practical, necessary, and free of demands. Naya's fingers tightened slightly at her sides as she weighed whether accepting something so simple would bind her to anything. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped forward and took the cup, drinking slowly. The water soothed her throat, strained from hours of silence and tension. Austin didn't watch her drink. He crouched near the stove and added a piece of wood, adjusting the damper until the fire settled into a steady burn. The small increase in warmth eased the stiffness in the room, breaking some of the cold distance between them. Naya moved a few inches farther inside, still close enough to the door that she could leave if needed. Her gaze drifted over his belongings, tidy stacks of wool blankets, a coiled rope carefully hung on a wall peg, a map rolled tight and placed on a shelf. Whoever Austin Morrow was, he lived with discipline. Nothing was scattered or neglected. She could read a man's habits by his space, and this space told her he relied on routine to control whatever weighed on him. Austin finally spoke, his tone level and simple. "You can sit if you want." He didn't gesture to a specific chair. He didn't point where she should sleep. He left the choice entirely to her. Naya pulled out the chair near the wall and sat with her back straight, keeping her hands folded in her lap. Her heart beat faster than she let show, each breath careful. She wasn't terrified. She had survived worse places, but she was alert, waiting to see how this new environment behaved around her. Austin remained by the stove for a long moment, as if deciding whether to say more. He hadn't brought another person into his cabin since the day he built it, and the presence of someone else stirred old memories he usually kept sealed away. He wasn't accustomed to being watched or to the subtle tension of another person's breathing in his space. He finally moved to the table, pulled out the other chair, and sat. The lantern's glow revealed lines on his face etched by sun, wind, and long nights of choosing solitude over conversation. Naya studied him quietly. He wasn't trying to impress her or intimidate her. He simply existed with the same quiet strength she had seen earlier that day. She couldn't identify his intentions yet, but she sensed that he wasn't the type to hide them behind flattery or threats. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It held the weight of two people who didn't know each other's boundaries yet and were trying to respect them. After a while, Austin rose and retrieved a folded wool blanket from the shelf. He placed it at the foot of the bed before stepping aside. "Use it if you need it," he said. Again, no expectation, no command. Naya approached the bed with cautious steps. She tested the mattress with her hand. It was firm but clean. She sat down slowly, her body heavy from exhaustion she had forced herself to ignore all day. For the first time since sunrise, her legs stopped trembling. Austin walked to the window and checked the yard, scanning the darkening tree line as if expecting riders or trouble. It was a habit pulled from years of guarding cattle herds at night. He stayed by the window until he was sure the area was clear. Only then did he remove his boots and set them beside the chair. Naya watched him closely, trying to judge the nature of this man through small actions. When he finally sat again, he kept both hands resting loosely on his knees, a posture that showed he wasn't hiding weapons or making sudden moves. The stove crackled softly, filling the quiet. Naya lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, her back to the wall. She pulled the blanket only halfway over her, keeping her arms free. Old reflexes refused to let her sleep unprepared. Her eyes remained open even as her body begged for rest. Austin adjusted the lantern flame to a low setting, leaving the room dim but visible. He didn't lie down. Instead, he sat on the chair and watched the window, listening to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, wind brushing the cabin siding, the horse shifting in the corral. After several minutes, he sensed Naya's breathing change, not fully asleep, but close. He spoke softly, his voice steady. "No one comes out here unless they're lost." The words weren't meant to reassure her. They were meant to state a truth about the land, one that indirectly told her she was safe for the night. Naya didn't answer. Her eyes closed slowly, the tension in her jaw easing as the warmth of the stove reached her. For the first time in months, she allowed her guard to lower just enough to drift toward sleep. Austin continued his quiet watch, feeling a subtle internal shift he couldn't explain. He had lived alone by choice, keeping his world small and predictable. Yet tonight, his cabin felt different. Not crowded, not invaded, just different, as if the space had widened to include someone else's presence. He didn't know what dawn would bring. He didn't know if she would stay or flee or demand answers. But he understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had made the right choice at the trading post, even if he didn't understand why. Outside, the wind moved across the clearing, and the night deepened around the cabin as two strangers shared the same roof for the first time. First light crept through the small cabin window, landing in a narrow band across the floorboards. The fire in the stove had burned down to a faint glow, leaving the room cool enough for Naya to wake with a sharp breath. She opened her eyes slowly, momentarily uncertain of where she was. The quiet inside the cabin felt unfamiliar. No shouting, no rope scraping, no hurried footsteps. Only the faint crackle of embers and the distant sound of a horse shifting in the corral. She sat up without making noise, her muscles stiff from the tension she had carried into sleep. The blanket Austin had offered lay loosely over her legs. She folded it neatly at the edge of the bed, not out of obligation, but because she refused to leave things in disarray. Austin's chair was empty. His boots were gone. For a moment, her heartbeat quickened, panic flickering in her chest as she imagined he might return with strangers or that she had misjudged his intentions. But through the window, she spotted him outside, walking the fence line with slow, measured steps. He checked every post as if he had done it at the same hour every morning for years. No rush, no nerves, no concern that she might flee. His steady routine surprised her more than any guarded stare could have. She moved through the cabin with careful steps, examining the layout without touching anything unnecessary. The orderliness of his belongings struck her again. Tools arranged by size, a tin of beans sealed and placed above the stove, a folded shirt resting near a wooden crate. None of it suggested a man expecting company, yet all of it suggested someone who survived alone by keeping his world precise. When she noticed the cupboard door hanging slightly crooked from its hinge, she paused. Instinct pulled her forward. She tested the looseness with her fingers, confirming it could be fixed quickly. Repairing things had been her way of staying useful in places where she had no power. It had helped her survive, helped her remain unnoticed, helped her hold onto something resembling control. She found a small metal tool on the table, likely left from Austin's work the night before, and knelt beside the cupboard. The hinge screws needed tightening. Her hands shook slightly from exhaustion, but she steadied them, focusing on the task rather than the tremors. The door clicked into place with a clean, even sound. The simple success brought an unexpected sense of grounding. She exhaled quietly, relieved to have done something that belonged to her rather than to fear. Footsteps sounded outside. Not hurried, not heavy, just Austin's steady walk returning from the yard. Naya rose immediately, unsure if he would disapprove of her touching his things. She stood near the table, posture straight, hands loosely clasped. When Austin entered, dust clung to his coat, and the morning air followed him in. He noticed the repaired cupboard instantly, his eyes shifting to the hinge before they moved to her. He didn't question her. He didn't ask why she had done it. He didn't thank her. Instead, he acknowledged the change with a subtle lift of his chin, as if the gesture alone conveyed acceptance. Naya felt something tighten and then ease in her chest. She wasn't sure what to call the feeling, but it wasn't fear. Austin set a small bucket of water near the stove, his voice low and even. Coffee will take a while. Fire needs building. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an invitation. It was simply information. She stepped toward the stove, glancing at him for permission. He gave none, but he didn't stop her. She opened the stove door, saw the embers, and added thin pieces of wood until the fire caught. The warmth began to spread again. Austin watched long enough to be sure the fire was safe, then hung his coat on a peg. His movements remained calm, revealing a man who had spent years forming habits that kept him stable. Naya studied him in those moments, searching for signs of impatience or hidden temper. She found neither. When the fire settled, she picked up one of the buckets and carried it outside. The cold air rushed into her lungs, startling but refreshing. Austin didn't follow her. He moved to the corral and checked the horse's hooves with practiced hands. Naya walked toward the well. She carried the bucket with both arms, not because the weight was unmanageable, but because she didn't want to drop something that belonged to him. She steadied her steps across the packed earth, her feet moving in deliberate balance. At the well, she drew up fresh water, listening carefully to the wooden crank and the rope sliding over its pulley. Every sound seemed louder in the quiet morning. She filled the bucket and returned to the cabin, wobbling only slightly from fatigue. She placed the water beside the stove with a careful nod to herself, satisfied she had not failed the small task. Inside, Austin set his tools in order on the table. He didn't comment on her effort, and she didn't expect him to. Instead, they moved around each other with a rhythm that had formed without discussion. He didn't reach for her work. She didn't interfere with his. Later, she stepped outside to take in the land around the cabin. Long ridges rose on either side, framing a wide meadow where tufts of grass bent under faint wind. The isolation struck her sharply. If she chose to run, there was nowhere close to hide, and she wasn't strong enough yet to outrun anyone. But Austin wasn't watching her with suspicion. He was checking the barn roof, ensuring the boards hadn't loosened. No trap, no pressure, just two people sharing space because circumstances had placed them there. Naya let out a slow breath, her body easing for the first time in days. She still didn't trust him fully. Trust required safety that had to be proven, not spoken. But this morning, nothing had been taken from her. Nothing had been demanded. She returned to the doorway, watching Austin as he examined a broken latch on the barn. The quiet between them felt different than the night before. Not friendly, not intimate, but steady in a way that didn't shake her balance. She stood there a long moment, realizing with a sharp clarity. For the first time in months, she wasn't bracing for something terrible to happen. Austin glanced at her briefly, then went back to his work, unaware that his ordinary routine had given her something she hadn't felt in a long time. A morning without fear. By late afternoon, the sky took on a muted tone that signaled the shift toward evening. The wind had slowed, leaving the clearing unusually still. Austin finished stacking the last of the repaired fence rails near the barn and wiped the back of his hand across his brow. The day had passed with an unexpected ease. He worked without interruption, and every time he glanced toward the cabin, he saw no signs of unrest, only the faint movement of Naya organizing or tending to small tasks. Inside, Naya stood near the stove, studying the few ingredients available. Beans, flour, a strip of dried meat, and a handful of herbs. Nothing luxurious, nothing wasted. She examined each item, choosing what could be combined into something warm. Cooking had often been a dangerous task in the past. Serving the wrong person first or taking too long meant consequences. But here, No one had ordered her to prepare anything. She did it because she needed to contribute, to balance the weight of being in a stranger's home. She lit the stove with careful hands, adjusting the damper until the flame steadied. The heat slowly filled the room, making the air smell faintly of smoke and dry wood. She chopped the dried meat into small pieces so it would soften quickly, stirring them into a pot of beans and water. As the mixture warmed, her shoulders loosened slightly. The simple act of creating something useful steadied her nerves. When Austin entered the cabin, the aroma reached him before he stepped fully inside. He paused near the doorway, caught off guard by the warmth in the air. He wasn't used to coming home to a meal. For years, evenings meant silent cooking, eating standing up, then returning to whatever chore he had left unfinished. Now, the cabin held something different, quiet effort from another pair of hands. Naya turned from the stove when she heard his step. Her posture straightened, unsure how he would react. She didn't assume he wanted food. She didn't assume he would welcome her efforts. She simply gestured toward the pot with a small movement, waiting for his judgment. Austin studied her expression first, not the food. He recognized the guarded waiting in her eyes, an expectation of criticism she had learned from others. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he set his gloves on the table and approached the stove. He lifted the lid, inhaled once, then lowered it gently. "Smells good," he said in a quiet tone that revealed no grand praise but held a clear sincerity. The tension in Naya's fingers loosened. She ladled a portion into 2 bowls, placing one at each side of the table. She didn't sit until he walked around the table and pulled out his chair. Only then did she lower herself into hers, keeping her back straight and her hands steady. They ate without haste. The cabin filled with the muted sounds of spoons against tin bowls and firewood shifting softly inside the stove. Neither felt the need to fill the air with commentary. Their silence wasn't heavy. It was careful, shaped by 2 people learning how to share space without stepping into each other's wounds. At one point, Naya glanced at Austin's hands. They were strong, scarred, and steady, the hands of a man who had rebuilt his life from rough timber and long work. She wondered what kind of loneliness had shaped him into someone who could stand beside danger without raising his voice. Austin studied her posture in return. She ate quietly, but not timidly. She took measured bites, scanning the room between movements, gauging exits and shadows, a habit she didn't hide. He understood it without needing to ask. Halfway through the meal, the wind picked up outside, brushing against the cabin walls. Naya stiffened slightly at the sudden sound. Austin noticed the reaction and set his spoon down without comment. He stood, walked to the window, and scanned the clearing. Nothing moved but brush swaying lightly in the breeze. "It's just wind," he said, not as reassurance, but as a statement of fact. She nodded, though her chest stayed tight for a few seconds. Memories of ambushes and sudden violence had trained her body to react before her mind had time to evaluate. Austin returned to his seat. He didn't look at her pityingly. He didn't press her to talk. His calm return to eating did more to steady her than any speech could have. When the meal was finished, Naya reached for the pot to clean it. Austin stood before she could lift it. "I'll handle it," he said. She paused, unsure if he was correcting her behavior or simply offering help. But the tone held no reprimand. It was simply his choice. She stepped aside, watching as he carried the pot to the small basin near the wall. His movements remained consistent, slow, methodical, and surprisingly gentle for a man who had spent decades working rough land. While he washed the pot, she gathered the bowls and stacked them neatly in the corner. She didn't want the cabin to feel crowded by her presence, so she kept everything in precise order. After the chores, Austin stepped outside to check the sky. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the ridge, painting the clearing in a soft, dim light. Naya followed him to the doorway and stood quietly, her hands resting against the frame. She didn't intend to speak. She just wanted to understand the land she might be living on temporarily. Austin shifted slightly to give her a clear view. His gaze remained on the horizon, studying it with the instinct of a man who had spent years depending on early signs of danger or weather shifts. Naya felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, Not trust, not comfort, but a careful easing of the tension she carried. She wasn't waiting for an order. She wasn't bracing for punishment. She was simply standing beside someone who didn't expect anything from her except presence. When the last of the daylight faded, they returned inside. Austin lit the lantern, adjusting the wick until a steady glow filled the room. Naya sat near the stove, warming her hands. He placed a small piece of wood beside her, a quiet indication she could add it to the fire if needed. For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale without calculation. This wasn't home yet. This wasn't safety, but it was a place where the world didn't come at her all at once. And that for now was enough. Morning arrived without warning gusts or restless animals, giving the clearing an appearance of calm that didn't match the tension waiting just beyond its borders. Austin had been repairing a section of the barn wall, hammer in hand, when he noticed a thin line of dust rising along the distant ridge. His posture shifted immediately, shoulders straightening, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing as he measured the movement. Dust didn't rise on its own out here. Something or someone had kicked it up. Inside the cabin, Naya folded a shirt Austin had left near the bed. She paused halfway through the motion, sensing a change in the air outside. The land had a way of announcing things subtly, a faint tremor in the ground, a shift in the wind, a silence after birds flew off. Whatever Austin had noticed, she felt it too. He set the hammer down without rushing. Years of dealing with unpredictable riders had taught him to conserve reaction. Quick fear wasted energy. Slow readiness saved lives. Two riders emerged from behind the ridge a few minutes later, silhouettes growing clearer as they descended the slope. They weren't moving quickly. They weren't trying to hide their presence. Their pace had the relaxed arrogance of men who believed no one would challenge them. Austin's hand hovered near the rifle resting against the barn wall, not touching it, just acknowledging it. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't going to let trouble step onto his land unchecked. Naya moved toward the doorway, but stopped short when she recognized the shapes. A cold pressure gripped her chest. These two had stood near the trader the day before, watching her with a sour interest that made her stomach tighten. She had hoped they wouldn't track her this far. She had hoped she would have more time to feel safe. Austin turned slightly, catching sight of her. Her eyes had sharpened, all calm drained out. Her breathing grew shallow, her fingers curling against her sides. She didn't speak. Fear had taught her silence, but her expression said enough. He stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the approaching riders. The men reined in their horses near the corral. Dust settled slowly around their boots as they dismounted. One of them, tall with a jagged scar running down his cheek, spat into the dirt and glanced toward the cabin. "Morning," he said, voice low and unfriendly. "We're looking for something that was taken from the post." Austin didn't answer immediately. He let the quiet stretch until the men shifted uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his words were steady and plain. "Nothing here belongs to you." The second rider, broader and younger, smirked. "We heard different." His gaze drifted toward the cabin window where Naya had stepped just out of sight. Trader said that Apache girl wasn't paid for properly. Austin's eyes stayed fixed on them, not on the cabin. He took the money. "She's free." Scarred Cheek shook his head slowly. "That's not how it works. Folks got claims. She knows that. Bring her out. We'll take her off your hands." Inside, Naya gripped the edge of the window frame so hard her knuckles whitened. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She knew how these conversations usually ended: enforced compliance, tied wrists, and pain disguised as ownership. She didn't want Austin involved. She didn't want him pulled into anyone else's greed. But she also knew the men wouldn't leave quietly. Austin didn't reach for his rifle, but his stance tightened enough to make both riders straighten. "No one here is leaving with you," he said. The younger man laughed under his breath. "You sure about that? We ain't looking for trouble, but we're not walking off empty." Austin stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to make his refusal unavoidable. His voice lost any remaining softness. "You've said your piece. Now ride." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was wind brushing through dry grass. The men exchanged a look. Not fear, calculation. They studied Austin's posture, the steady way his feet stayed planted, the calmness in his eyes that didn't match a man bluffing. They took note of the rifle within reach and the unmistakable readiness of someone who had defended ground before. Scarred Cheek clicked his tongue and stepped back toward his horse. Fine, but this ain't done. Austin didn't react. He waited as they mounted. The younger rider gave one last lingering glance toward the cabin, then jerked his reins and followed his partner back up the ridge. Naya stayed hidden until the dust trail disappeared fully behind the hill. Only then did she step out from her spot near the window. Her hands trembled, but her expression held something stronger than fear, wary gratitude mixed with disbelief. Austin didn't turn around immediately. He watched the horizon for several long seconds, ensuring the riders didn't circle back. Only after he was certain the threat had passed did he let out a slow breath and step onto the cabin porch. Naya stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself tightly. She wasn't waiting for reassurance. She wasn't expecting praise. She was waiting to see if he regretted stepping between her and danger. He met her eyes with a calm he had earned through years of surviving harder days. You're safe here. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to comfort. They were simply the truth as he saw it. Naya swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't stop. I know, he said, leaning one hand on the porch post. But they won't take you. A quiet shiver moved through her as she processed the certainty in his tone. No one had spoken about her safety like it was something obvious, something non-negotiable. She stepped outside, just enough that the evening light touched her face. The fear still lingered behind her eyes, but a new steadiness replaced part of it. Fragile, but growing. Austin didn't touch her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. His presence, unshaken and unwavering, said enough. Naya stood beside him, inhaling the cool air with a shaky breath. For the first time in a long while, she felt danger retreat. Not completely, but far enough that she could breathe without bracing for the next blow. This land was still harsh. The world still dangerous. But tonight, she wasn't facing it alone. The morning after the riders left, the clearing carried a different weight. One that wasn't fear, but the after effect of danger passing close enough to leave its mark. The air felt sharper, the wind colder, the silence thicker. Naya woke before the sun, her body responding to old instincts she couldn't shake. For a moment she stayed still, listening for unfamiliar footsteps or the sound of horses. When she heard none, she rose and folded the blanket neatly again, grounding herself through the familiar movement. Austin had already stepped outside. She heard the porch boards creak under his boots, followed by the soft jingle of a harness. He wasn't rushing or scanning the ridge nervously. His posture stayed the same as always, steady, purposeful, built on routine. The threat from yesterday hadn't shaken his habits, which surprised her. Most men grew jumpy after confrontation, but Austin simply adjusted his day and continued. She stepped out of the cabin slowly, stopping at the edge of the porch. He was brushing the bay horse, running the curry comb along its flank with calm, even strokes. The animal responded with a relaxed snort, nudging his arm as if the world hadn't changed at all. Austin acknowledged the gesture with a faint shift of his mouth, something close to a smile, but not quite. Naya crossed the clearing, picking up the empty water bucket. She walked with a firmer step than she had on her first day here. Her wrists still ached from the rope burns, but her arms no longer shook when she carried weight. As she approached the well, she noticed Austin glance her way, not assessing her, not monitoring her, simply acknowledging she was moving about the land as if she had a place in the routine. She drew water slowly, letting the sound of the pulley and rope steady her breathing. When she returned to the cabin, she found a small bundle of clothing folded neatly near the bed. Austin must have placed it there earlier. A shirt, slightly mended at the shoulder seam, and a pair of trousers with a drawstring that would fit her frame. Nothing fancy, nothing new, but clean and durable. She ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling a strange pressure rise in her chest. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something quieter, heavier, recognition that he expected her to have choices. Clothing meant mobility. Clothing meant dignity. She held the shirt carefully, unsure how to react to a gesture she hadn't experienced in a long time. Outside, Austin finished feeding the horse and stepped into the barn to check the bridle hooks. Naya stood in the doorway, watching him as she slipped the shirt over her shoulders. It fit loosely but comfortably. She tied the trousers with a firm knot and stepped onto the porch with more confidence than she expected to feel. When Austin emerged from the barn, he paused briefly at the sight of her in the new clothes. He didn't stare or look surprised. He simply gave a slight nod that told her he had anticipated the change and accepted it without needing to comment. She walked toward the barn with measured steps, stopping beside him. "The latch on the right stall door is loose," she said quietly, her eyes on the wood rather than him. "It'll break soon if a horse pushes on it." Her voice held certainty, not fear, not hesitation, just fact. Austin raised an eyebrow slightly. "Show me." They entered the barn together. Dust floated gently in the air, illuminated by the morning light streaming through gaps in the boards. Naya knelt beside the stall and pointed out the weakened hinge. Austin crouched next to her, studying the wood with a level focus. He tested it with his hand, then nodded once. "You're right," he said. "I'll fix it today." Naya looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for a fraction of a second before shifting away. The brief connection made her chest tighten, not from discomfort, but from the awareness that he valued her observations. Austin stood and fetched a small box of nails. As he hammered the hinge into place, Naya helped hold the wood steady. Their hands came close once or twice, but neither pulled away. There was no tension in the proximity, only silent cooperation. When the work was done, they stepped outside. The wind had picked up again, brushing across the clearing with a crisp chill. Naya crossed her arms instinctively, bracing against the cold. Without a word, Austin reached inside the barn and handed her a worn wool coat. She hesitated before taking it. "It's heavy," she said softly. "It'll keep you warm," he replied. She slipped into the coat, adjusting the collar around her neck. It smelled faintly of horses and wood smoke, familiar scents that eased her nerves. Later, inside the cabin, she prepared a small pot of tea using dried herbs she found near the stove. She didn't know if Austin liked tea, but she set a cup at the table anyway. When he entered, he sat without question, accepting the warm drink with a quiet thanks. The word was simple, but hearing it from him felt significant. As they drank, the fire crackled steadily, casting a soft glow across the room. Naya's shoulders eased as she warmed her hands on the cup. Austin watched the flames, his expression thoughtful. Maybe about the riders, maybe about her, maybe about things he didn't share. She noticed something had shifted between them. Yesterday, she had been someone he felt responsible for. Today, she was becoming someone he worked alongside. When the tea was gone, she stood and placed her cup in the basin. Austin rose as well, brushing dust from his hands. "You did good work today," he said, voice low but firm. She didn't know how to respond at first. Praise wasn't something she trusted, but she finally nodded, her voice steady. "So did you." Austin's breath left him in a quiet exhale. Almost a laugh, but restrained, as if unfamiliar with expressing warmth openly. Evening settled around the cabin as they stepped outside again. The sky shifted into deep blue, and the first stars appeared above the ridge. Naya stood beside him, her posture no longer tense, her gaze steady on the horizon. Nothing needed to be said. She had survived cruelty, captivity, hunger, and loneliness. Now, for the first time, she was learning how to stand still without fear. The next several days unfolded without unexpected visitors or raised voices, giving the land around the cabin a rare sense of steadiness. The air stayed cool through the mornings, warming into mild afternoons before dropping sharply again at dusk. Each day brought new tasks, and without any discussion, Austin and Naya began moving through them side by side in a quiet rhythm neither had planned. On the fourth morning, Naya stepped out before sunrise. She paused on the porch, listening to the faint rattle of insects waking in the brush and the gentle stomp of the bay horse in the corral. The cold air pushed against her face, sharpening her senses. She still woke each day, expecting some new threat, but the fear no longer controlled her movements. She walked toward the well with steady steps, bucket in hand, her breath creating small clouds in front of her. Austin was already in the barn, tightening straps on the saddle that hung from a beam. He glanced at her when she passed, but didn't interrupt her work. He appreciated people who didn't need constant direction. She appreciated someone who didn't treat silence like a problem. Inside the cabin, Naya prepared a simple breakfast, cornmeal mush and dried berries she found tucked in a jar above the stove. She experimented with the right amount of water, studying the consistency until it stopped looking too thin. She stirred slowly, testing the smell and texture. She didn't rush the process. She wanted to contribute something solid, something that showed she respected the space she lived in. Austin came in a moment later, brushing dust from his shirt. When he saw the pot simmering, he took 2 bowls from the shelf without being asked. He set them on the table with quiet deliberation, the same way he did everything. She divided the food evenly, and they ate with an ease far different from the careful meal they shared earlier in the week. He didn't tell her the meal was good. She didn't ask for approval, but the small, almost imperceptible relaxing of his shoulders told her enough. After breakfast, they stepped outside together. The sun rose in a slow line across the ridge, sending long shadows across the clearing. Naya knelt beside the herb patch near the cabin, checking which leaves were still fresh enough to use. She clipped several stems with a small knife she found among Austin's tools. He watched from a few feet away, noticing how careful she was with the plants, as if she didn't want to take more than she needed. When she stood, he handed her a small cloth pouch. For storage, he said. She accepted it quietly, folding the herbs inside with practiced hands. Later in the day, Austin repaired a section of the roof that had begun to sag. He climbed carefully, placing each step with precision. Naya remained below, gathering fallen twigs and sweeping the porch. She didn't speak unless necessary, and neither did he. Their communication happened mostly through gestures. She pointed to a loose board he might miss. He handed her a tool without breaking focus. In the afternoon, she worked on the horse's bridle. The leather strap had weakened near the buckle, and she wanted it replaced before it failed. Austin came over when he heard the sound of her working the stitching. "You know leatherwork?" he asked, not surprised, just curious. "Some," she replied, trimming the thread cleanly. He nodded once. "Good. Saves trouble later." Her chest warmed slightly at that simple acknowledgement. Not praise, not gratitude, just recognition of skill. It was enough. By evening, the cabin carried a different energy. The flame from the stove gave off a soft glow that stretched across the floorboards. Austin sat sharpening a small hatchet. Naya patched a tear in one of the blankets, her needle moving with controlled precision. Neither seemed aware of how naturally they occupied the same room now. Their movements didn't clash or disturb each other. They almost fit, like 2 pieces of a routine that had always existed but had just now found the right shape. When the stitching was finished, Naya folded the blanket and laid it across the bed. She caught Austin watching her, not intently, but with a subtle curiosity he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "You work fast," he said. She shook her head lightly. "Just want things to last." "They will," he replied. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the cabin into deeper shadow. Naya stepped outside, drawn by the cooling air. The land stretched wide around her, open and quiet, the sky shifting into deep shades of blue. She didn't feel exposed the way she had when she first arrived. The open space no longer looked like a trap. It looked like a boundary she could learn to trust. Austin joined her on the porch, leaning one shoulder against the post. He didn't stand too close. He didn't intrude on her thoughts. He simply shared the same line of sight, watching the light drain from the sky. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked suddenly, not accusing, just probing gently. She took a slow breath. "No, not tonight." He nodded, accepting her answer without pressing for more. After a long moment, she stepped off the porch and walked toward the edge of the clearing. The wind brushed her hair across her shoulders. She turned back to look at him. He hadn't moved. His silhouette stood steady, framed by the soft glow from inside the cabin. In that quiet exchange, her glance, his presence, Something unspoken settled between them. Not dependence, not obligation. Something simpler and stronger. A shared understanding that they were no longer strangers moving around each other. They were learning how to stay. 3 days passed without a sign of riders on the ridge, giving both Austin and Naya time to work, rest, and breathe without interruption. The tension in the clearing eased in small increments, replaced by a steadier rhythm that neither of them had expected at the start of the week. The cabin felt warmer, not because of the stove alone, but because nothing inside it felt temporary anymore. On a cool morning, Naya stepped outside before dawn. She wrapped the wool coat around her shoulders and watched the horizon brighten. The first hints of sunlight painted the tops of the grass in faint gold, and the air carried the earthy scent of dew settling across the field. She stood still, letting the quiet sink into her bones. It was the first morning she hadn't woken in fear since leaving captivity. Austin approached from the barn, his boots pressing a soft rhythm into the ground. He had been checking the animals, feeding the horse, and securing the gate before the day began. When he reached the porch, he paused beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her, beside her. "You slept longer," he said in a low voice. She didn't deny it. "I wasn't listening for footsteps last night." He nodded once. It was the kind of progress he didn't comment on, but he recognized its weight. They worked through the morning without breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Naya gathered herbs and organized the shelves inside the cabin. Austin repaired a cracked board on the porch and inspected the tools leaning against the wall. By midday, the sun had warmed the clearing enough that the two of them shared a quiet lunch at the table. No fear lingered in Naya's posture. No guardedness sat behind Austin's eyes. After the meal, she stepped outside to hang a warm blanket on the line to air out. Austin watched her movements carefully, not because he worried she might run, but because he caught something different in the way she held herself. Her shoulders no longer curved inward. Her steps no longer hesitated between tasks. She wasn't waiting for danger to return. She was allowing herself to exist fully in the space around her. When she turned back toward the cabin, she found him standing on the porch. He looked as though he had been deciding whether to speak or remain quiet. "I need to tell you something," he said, his tone calm but heavier than usual. She stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "What is it?" He rested one hand on the porch rail. "Those men might come back someday. Maybe with more people. Maybe not. But I'll be here when they do." Naya held his gaze steadily. "You don't owe me that." "I'm not saying it because of a debt," he replied. "I'm saying it because I choose to." The words hit her harder than she expected. Most people offered protection with conditions. Most people expected something in return. Austin offered it as simply as he offered her water that first night. No conditions, no price. She swallowed, her voice softening. "I didn't think anyone would stand in front of trouble for me again. You don't have to think about that alone anymore." For a long moment, neither moved. The wind brushed lightly through the grass, carrying the smell of warm earth and distant juniper. Naya felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not gratitude, but a steady certainty she hadn't let herself acknowledge until now. She wasn't an obligation in this cabin. She wasn't a burden he tolerated. She was becoming part of the place. Later that evening, as the last of the daylight faded, Naya prepared a small meal while Austin swept the porch. When they sat down to eat, the lantern's glow created a soft halo across the walls, casting long shadows that made the cabin feel intimate and lived in. After the dishes were set aside, Naya stepped outside again. The sky above the ridge had turned a deep shade of blue, and stars began to appear one by one. She listened to the stillness, feeling her heartbeat settle into a slow, steady rhythm. Austin joined her without speaking, hands resting loosely on the railing. She turned to him, her expression calm but full of unspoken meaning. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "Not because I have nowhere else. Because this feels like a place I can stand without being afraid." Austin's breath left him in a slow exhale. "Then stay," he said. "This land is big enough for both of us." She stepped closer, the small distance between them disappearing as she reached for his hand. He accepted it willingly, his grip warm and steady. It was the first time she had touched him without fear guiding the motion. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He didn't rush the moment. They simply stood together, watching the night settle across the land they now shared. When they returned inside, Naya gathered her few belongings, folded cloth, a small carving she had kept hidden, and the clothes Austin had given her, and placed them neatly beside his. Not at the foot of the bed, not in a corner, beside his. Austin watched her with a quiet steadiness, understanding what the action meant even without words. The fire crackled softly. The lantern flickered. The cabin no longer felt like a solitary man's refuge. It felt like a home shaped by two people who had chosen the same shelter, the same silence, the same future. Outside, the wind moved gently across the clearing, carrying away the last remnants of fear. Inside, for the first time in their lives, neither Austin nor Naya felt alone.